Okay, so a couple of random observations before we move forward. I was mentioning like the movie is comically slow. One of my favorite lines in the movie that's comically slow is when the police go into the bedroom and they go, "Is this the bedroom?" Yes. You sleep here? Yep. Like, of course it's the bedroom. Like, oh my God, if there's a giant bed in it, how hard is this to figure out? Um, it's a great detail. There also may be a small detail. I'm not sure how important this is, but they mentioned that there's another bedroom, but Fred's turned it into a practice room. Part of this, the cops may be asking because they're wondering if Fred and Renee have children. The second bedroom would normally be for like a child, but they don't have children because they don't have sex. The sex life seems to not be functioning so good. But I don't know how important that is. Probably not. This is not a movie about children, so not that big a deal. Um, okay. Um, yeah. All right. Let's move forward here. Um, the other thing, there's another great detail when she's talking on to the cops. She says, they say, "Where's the house located?" She says, "Near the observatory." The observatory is a big thing for looking at stars and planets, and it's up in the Hollywood Hills because it's above the city lights and above the city, and closer to space or whatever. So, um, it's up there. But it's just interesting in a movie where the characters are being observed against their will by a floating movie camera in their home. She mentions they live near the observatory, and then they go outside with the cops, and there's an overhead shot of them all together being observed by us, obviously, but also feels like supernatural creatures. Okay, cool. Um, so right, and there's other one of the things that makes this movie neat is like Night of the Hunter. It's got these unrealistic details in it. So like when Fred looks up and when he drives home from the party, he sees like a light in his house and thinks someone is in there. But it's like a crazy giant searchlight in his home. Like it's impossible to imagine anything. It's not like a flashlight. It's like a crazy strong like super light. Um, and then there's this camera shot where he's looking around the home, and there's this disorienting thing where the camera is kind of winding around his home, but then and you think for a second that's his viewpoint, like he's looking around his home to see who's there. So you're like, oh, I'm looking through his eyes, and then he turns and he's looking at himself, and it's a mirror. It's that same kind of disorienting thing that you see in 2001: A Space Odyssey when we assume we're looking out of the guy's eyes, but then he's looking at himself because he's over there now. Like it's very disorienting. And David Lynch loves to do sort of these sort of disorienting things. Um, let's talk about the prison for a hot second. The prison where Fred ends up is again hilariously unrealistic. First of all, the trial is super rushed. It's just like boom, you're guilty of murder, you're going to jail, you're on death row. It's exactly as fast as the trial in Night of the Hunter, right? It's like just lightning. David Lynch doesn't want to spend time on lawyers in a courtroom scene. He just skips it. He's like, yep, you're in jail, death row, murdered your wife, move on. Hilariously though, it Fred is the only person we see. He's the only prisoner we see. So he's like in the yard and it's completely empty. He seems to be the only prisoner. And there's a joke that the guards say when they're one of the guards, played by Henry Rollins, who's a musician from the '90s, says, "Man, that wife killer's pretty fucked up." And then the other guard goes, "Which one?" And then they both crack up laughing. It's a complicated joke because it can go two directions. The joke may be, which one? Well, there's only one guy here, so that guy. Or the joke could be, which one? Which wife killer? Because so many men kill their wives. In which case they're laughing because murdering your wife is such a common crime. And this is a movie about masculinity being threatened and the terrible things that men do when their fragile masculinity is broken. So it speaks to a larger issue about the violence of men towards women, which is something we've been exploring in Night of the Hunter and The Shining and Blue Velvet and Vertigo. And right, so all right, we're doing good. Um, it's also when Fred has his vision of the cabin, which is exploding in reverse, he sees it through curtains, red curtains kind of open to show him that. It involves both fire and smoke. The bulb above the prison has electricity flickering. These things have all appeared earlier in the movie. When Fred's talking about his dream that the fire's going really fast in his home, there's billowing smoke coming out, there's weird electrical shit in the lighting. At Fred's home. So like these are and he has those red curtains in his home. So that's uncanny, right? It's like this is very strange to see a cabin explode backwards where the smoke and the fire get sucked into the cabin and there's like flickering lights and a red curtain. But it's also familiar. These are things we know from Fred's house and from the dream Fred had. So it's both strange and familiar. It's the definition of uncanny. It's a very unusual kind of effect for a filmmaker to do. Because again, people can do vampires. Vampires are scary, but to do uncanny, you got to be requires more smarts than that. Jordan Peele, for example, is extremely good at the uncanny in the movie Us, which is really a tremendously good horror movie. Jordan Peele's a fucking genius, and Get Out and Us are both amazing. Uh, okay, cool. Um, okay, so I think we have reached the Peat section of Lost Highway. So I think I've said everything I want to say about Fred and Renee for now. Um, the camera goes into some kind of vagina-shaped wound, head wound thing. I don't know what's going on there. It's a very creepy, strange thing, although it suggests entering into psychic space, like a big cracked open head wound suggests entering into psychic space. And the fact that it looks vaguely like a vagina indicates psychosexual nightmare territory, which is exactly what this movie and this course is about. So now it's time to talk about Peat. Insanely, Fred seems to just transform. What is the relationship between Fred and Peat? There's not an obvious answer to that question. It's something like Stanley Kubrick in 2001. It's up to you to think about the relationship. Is Peat a dream Fred is having? Is Peat a psychotic vision Fred is having? Does Fred actually transform into Peat? And that's what the guards suggest, is that they look at the guy and they're like, this isn't the same guy. We got to let him go. So the relationship between Fred and Peat, it's left up to you. David Lynch, like Stanley Kubrick, thinks you're smart enough to decide for yourself what the relationship between these two guys are. Just like Kubrick thinks it's up to you to think about the relationship between what the monkeys are doing and what's happening on the moon and what's happening on Jupiter and what's happening at the end of that film. It treats you like you're smart, like you can figure it out. It's one of the reasons why I like this movie, is that David Lynch seems to think he trusts me to reach some of my own conclusions about this stuff. So let's talk a little bit about Peat. One of the funny things that happens when we move into the Peat story, and this is something that David Lynch and Tarantino have in common, which is it's hard to nail down what decade any of this is taking place in. The cars, like in Tarantino, it seems to both be modern day and the 1970s. And in David Lynch, it seems to both be modern day and the 1950s. The cars, in particular, are very 1950s cars, and the wearing of the leather jacket. But then there's all these 90s elements, like Smashing Pumpkins and Marilyn Manson shows up, and the cell phones. And Blue Velvet does the same thing, where it's like apparently supposed to be modern day. Kyle MacLachlan has an earring, but all the girls in the high school dress like they're from the musical Grease. It takes place in some kind of weird temporal no man's zone where it's like, I don't know what, it's a combination of decades because it's not supposed to be realistic. It's sort of a vision of what life could be like if he's combining the different elements from different decades. All right, cool. All right, so one of the things, like David Lynch also likes funny reversals. So like characters are, Pete's parents are obviously like, it seems like they were like in a biker gang or something when they were kids, but now they're middle-aged people, but they still both wear blue jeans and they both wear leather jackets and they both wear sunglasses indoors. But they're like really chilled out and nice. Gary Busey plays Pete's dad, and Gary Busey's famous for being a fucking lunatic, but he's like a nice guy in this movie. Him and his wife sit on the couch watching, I don't know, like a television show about picking strawberries that looks like it's something to keep 10-year-olds occupied in a school lesson. They're like very wholesome, and they're really worried about their son to the point where they have tears in their eyes, and they're sweet. Even though you expect bikers to be like dangerous, and you expect sort of parents bikers to be like you expect Gary Busey, the actor, to be very intense, but David Lynch loves to surprise you. And so he makes them bikers, but as sweet as possible. They're like so kind and sweet and brimming with emotion. It's something he also does in Twin Peaks, where all the biker guys are all sort of very adorable and lovely. Okay, cool. This is going pretty good, and I think that's all I want to say. But one thing to point out before we get to our next video is that Gary Busey is Pete's father, and he's like such a sweet guy. Eyes brimming with tears as he's worried about his son. But in a lot of these movies, what you've gotten used to in The Shining, in Night of the Hunter, is the two dads. And one of the dads, in Blue Velvet, one of the dads is nice, and the other one is fucking bad news. Robert Loggia as Mr. Eddie is the bad dad, as a counterpoint to Gary Busey, the good dad. All right, I'll see you in the next video.